You interact with these games in different ways. You interact with Command & Conquer very differently from how you interact with Zelda. You interact with Shadow of the Colossus in a very different way from how you interact with Katamari Damacy. You interact with Bioshock in a very different way from how you interact with Spider-Man. That's awesome. There's all of these spaces and all of these new things that you can do. So when you're kind of talking about innovation and finding ideas, you can really innovate within genre, within technology, within story, within gameplay mechanics, within the art style, within the characters, and I need to not go over my thing. Within the script, within just what the characters say, and within the environments. And that's just so much. You just don't have that in other mediums. It's kind of exciting, I reckon. So these are all areas where you can kind of have new ideas and like a spectrum in which you can innovate. But at the same time, you might not have ideas. You might be a hollow shell of a man or a woman, plodding through life, grey and alone. I'm sure none of you are. But you might be. But you might want to be something else. You might want to find your soul. And one of the original ideas for this panel was the idea about where ideas come from and what it actually means. And the very simple answer is that ideas are everywhere. Ideas are easy. Ideas are cheap. Everyone here, I know you're not grey and hollow, so I know that everyone here has like a million ideas. And that's awesome. That's really kind of cool. So when it comes time to be creative, I've jumped ahead. This is the worst presentation ever, I think. The only real trick about ideas is that you have to have experience. You have to have something to draw from. Anyone who saw John's presentation earlier, when he was talking about how he's interested in martial arts and dance and how that influences his design process, that's really interesting. For me, my influence tend to be family and the nature of memory and how they kind of influence us and the stories that we tell. And that's just my personal experience, and I'm sure that everyone here has some personal experience that helps to kind of dictate what they design and how they express themselves. So it's really just about getting out there and figuring out what is in your head and how you interact with life and all of those things, and then coming back when you've got all of that experience and thinking about how can I work through technology and story and genre and mechanics and art style and characters to make something new, to make something, for want of a better word, kind of innovative. And again, that's all really exciting. You know, that's kind of cool. And because games are young, 25 years, you know, we've got another probably 75 years before people start to go, oh, we've seen everything that a game can do. But like Spider-Man says, you got to be careful, because responsibility, blah, 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 blah. One of the kind of the things that I took away from John's presentation earlier was that games, just like all media, are about communication. Whether it's games, books, comics, music, cave paintings, or films, or TV, they're all about somebody saying, this is how I see the world, I want you to see it the same way as I do. And whether that's an audience of Brazilians or whether that's just you, it's still about exploring something and communicating something. You might only be communicating it with yourself. For example, the billiards one, what was the Oracle billiards? I think John said that, and I might be putting words in his mouth, but it was enough for him to kind of see that the idea worked and that he could move on to something new. Like your audience is still yourself. You're still finding out something about yourself, communicating something with yourself, which is you know, just as valid as trying to make Grand Theft Auto or Gears of War and communicate with an audience of 3 million or 8 million or whatever. And even games that kind of don't seem to be about that, for example, Gears of War, which doesn't seem to be about communicating anything, it just seems to be about blowing the shit out of aliens and shooting them in the head. Which is a shit end level, by the way. He should have been shot for that. They're still communicating about the references that have kind of dictated their life, that have kind of guided them and made them the creative person that they are. You know, Cliffy Bleszinski's obviously watched Aliens a lot, and read a lot of science fiction novels. And so that says something about him. It says something about the team that he's guiding. And they also have that kind of attempt to comment on a rich society, the whole destroyed beauty motif. So even in a game which looks like just a shooter, even a game which it's largely, according to Alan Tuscan, with zero innovation. There's still something there. There's still an idea, a guiding principle to it. Although, as I've written here, you do have to question what he's trying to say by putting a chainsaw on the front of a machine gun. I'm not sure there's anything highfalutin about that. One of the things, and I think this is one of the things that the panel is going to disagree on, that I think, is that because you have to be aware of the strengths and the weaknesses of the medium, you have to be far more aware of the audience, of a game. Because it's less of a guided experience, you have to be very, very conscious about what they're going to feel. And ultimately, our audience is the player. And I think the next one just is the player. So that's why I think, because we have to guide them, because we can't just say, this is what we want you to think, as you can do in a novel or a film, to a greater degree. We have to be very conscious about what the player is experiencing. So while you might have something you want to communicate, it's very important to continually kind of take a step back and go, am I actually communicating that? Is this the player experience I wanted to have?
Let's give 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes? Shit. This always happens to me. Alright, I'll kind of rush through. The question you have to ask yourself is, why are you innovating? Alright, I think. So as a designer or developer, you have an idea at some point, whether that's a mechanic, a story, or a character, and you start developing that idea. You start working through all of the kind of the permutations and how all of the other ideas connect to that idea. You know, and maybe you're doing some prototyping or whatever just to see if the gameplay works. But how do you know which ideas to keep and which ones to throw away? What I've found in my time in development is that things tend to just go through the cool test. Like, someone will just come up to you and go, is your idea cool? And you'll go, yes. And they'll go, well, it's in the game. There's kind of no balancing factor to say, is this actually kind of fitting in with what we're trying to do? And I think that's what you need to do. You need to test whether or not it fits the game. Because otherwise what you have is 200 cool things in your game and no sort of central idea. Because innovation for its own sake reduces a game, I think. A good example of that, I think, is Half-Life 2. I think it's awesome. I think it does incredible things with character and technology. But in trying to reduce the amount of exposition they have, they've almost destroyed the story. They've destroyed the player experience. You can go through that entire game without having an idea of what the fuck is going on. You can. There's all of this little stuff dotted around that you've just got no idea about. So I think they've tried to do too much, and they've lost sight of what the player should feel at the end of it, what information should they have at the end of it. And I think it's really important not to just innovate for the sake of innovating, because there are a whole bunch of tools and things that we know how to do already that can be used to communicate what we want our game to be. You know, and we can create incredible experiences out of that already with what we know about how games work. We can do things that pros and film only dream of with what we know already. So the most important thing, I think, is that ask yourself, do you need to do something new? Do you need to reinvent the wheel? Do you need to innovate? You might have to, that's completely fine. But you also might not have to, and that's completely fine as well. Everything should serve the game, I reckon. And by extension, communicate your idea to the audience. On to the last one. Basically, to kind of sum up, and I can't believe that was 15 minutes. Just be aware of why you're doing it. Be aware of why you're doing everything, why you're innovating, why you're not innovating, why you're choosing to create a new character or a new gameplay mechanic, what it is. If it's because you want to explore an idea or a theme for yourself, then just be honest with yourself that that's what you're doing. If you want to sell 3 million units by making a generic first-person shooter, that's cool too, but just be honest about it and just be aware of that. That's why you're doing it. Don't just do it because for the sake of being the first kid in the block or because you think being creative is sexy. Do it because it's worth it and it's because it's what you want to do and it's what's going to achieve the outcome that you want. I want to end on a positive note though. Not just saying that don't innovate because it's a waste of time. Games are incredibly young and the space is huge, like I said. The amount of potential games out there is enormous and we've only scratched the surface. And the audience is growing. It continues to grow. More and more people are playing games and more people will play games over the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200, 300 years.